Next curve.
Welcome to another Rethink podcast. This is Leonard Lee, Managing Director and founder of NextCurve. If you haven't already subscribed to our research blog at www.next-curve, please do. And we have a lot of complimentary research briefs and media content that you'll find insightful. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube and Apple podcast channels. Just search for NextCurve. Today, I'm joined by Dean Freeman, NextCurve Research Fellow and all-around semiconductor industry expert. Welcome, Dean. Good to have you again.
Thank you, Leonard. Always a pleasure.
Same here. And the topic for this episode is a pretty interesting one. When Softbank announced on July 17th of this year that they were looking to either spin off or sell Arm, there was a lot of speculation about who would buy it, quite frankly, what they would do with it. In terms of potential buyers, there's hypotheses about whether or not it would be Intel, it would be Qualcomm, it would be AMD, would it be Apple? And lo and behold, rumors settled on Nvidia. And for some, I think it was a head scratcher. And then for others, it seemed to make logical sense. So, Dean, let's talk about that. Why don't we talk about why would Nvidia come out in the forefront as a potential buyer for Arm? And then let's talk about how would Nvidia benefit from Arm? And then what would be the factors of success for integration for such a combination? And then finally, what would the industry implications be for an Nvidia plus Arm union? What do you think?
E.E. Times said it best. It's a terrible idea, although I think they used a little bit stronger words. There's no synergy.
Be nice.
There's no synergy between the two companies. So it's really Nvidia looking to add another feather to their cap or a coup. Nvidia makes GPUs. GPUs do not use ARM technology. They're very heavily involved in AI and the analytics, looking at the data because of how they can process data. They do not have, I'll call it, the core CPU logic in the GPU. And so that would be the potential reason why NVIDIA might want to look to invest in ARM. But the problem is ARM distributes to everybody. You know, if you're building a logic device, if you've got a microcontroller and then the CPU out there and you're not using x86, there's a very high probability you're using ARM. You might be using a Desto, IP, or someone else. There's a couple of other small IP companies out there that sell cores for microcontrollers and microprocessors, but you're probably using ARM technology. So that means what's going to happen is NVIDIA is going to go from a GPU company into now I've got this CPU logic intellectual property that really isn't a device. You know, I'm selling cores and helping company build semiconductors and design semiconductors, but I'm not, really building semiconductors. So to me, I struggle with where it would fit in the overall NVIDIA organization. If NVIDIA were to buy ARM and keep it as a wholly independent subsidiary and keep them in Cambridge and be their sugar daddy, sort of what SoftBank was for them, then I think it would make sense because ARM sort of needs to be, for lack of a better term, like Switzerland. They need to be neutral. Right. They need to be able to sell their intellectual property to anybody, anywhere, to build silicon and build silicon cores. If NVIDIA buys them, that doesn't work. Now you've got a company that's building silicon that owns ARM. So if I'm a competitor to NVIDIA, I come in and say, "Ooh, do I really want to buy their ARM, their cores?" So it means that I think over time, ARM would actually lose business as it goes on. And I don't think they'd cease to exist, but I think they'd have a much more limited scope in the industry than they currently do.
Okay, you pretty much took away all the talking points.
Oh.
Obviously, you did your homework. You're very passionate about the topic.
Well, we didn't talk about Apple yet, Leonard, and we didn't talk about who I think should buy Arm. Yeah,
That's not what you're supposed to do on a podcast. I'm just kidding. No, I think it's fantastic. I think you pretty much in a very short span covered it all. So bye, everybody.
Succinct. That's what we're looking for.
Yeah, but I totally agree with you. I think that, as I stated in a LinkedIn post that I made recently, that it dilutes their GPU-centric or centered narrative. And, up to this point, it's been about, NVIDIA has been about the GPU, as you said. And it's about how do we now virtualize the GPU and make it fit everything, quite frankly, right? I think it entails a certain type of unique strategy as well. I totally appreciate your comments there, Dean, because when you look at the business model that NVIDIA has as its core, it has some compatibility issues with Arm. They're fundamentally different businesses. One's a IP licensing business, and like you said, another is device and dare I say software. Virtualization of GPU, and let it replace everything else and let it be the core of everything. Almost like a counterpoint storyline to sort of the CPU narrative, right? If these two companies combine, to your point, how do you sustain the neutrality that is really sort of germane to the success of Arm to date? And that could be very, very difficult. And so the question to the executive management team at NVIDIA would be, well, how are you going to what kind of synergies are you going to drive through this transaction? Mm-hmm. And then how are you going to sustain the momentum that actually Arm has in the marketplace today?
No, exactly. Those are great points. I think I would be a little less diplomatic, if I.
You're very undiplomatic, Dean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let yourself go. This is your show.
It's late. It's late in the week and late in the day. So diplomacy has flown out the window until I get my adult beverage. It's that time between coffee and adult beverages. I think it'll be a huge challenge for integration between the two companies and the two cultures. You attended TechCon last year. You've done several deep dives with NVIDIA in some of the research that you've done. To me, it's just like, it's not quite oil and water, but it's pretty close. And so how are you going to get them to mix? How are you going to get them to work synergistically? Yeah. Well, what about Apple buying Arm? Well, that would make a little bit more sense because Apple makes their own chips. Apple does not compete. Apple makes devices. They do not make chips except for their own devices. So that might be interesting from a intellectual property perspective. The question then is, what happens with trust? I think potentially most of the companies that use Arm might feel comfortable with that because a lot of them sell product into Apple anyway. The other problem that might happen, though, is, as we talked about in an earlier podcast, is Apple is continuing to create their own silicon. Yeah. So would they start to get into where they take some of the devices that Cypress used to make for them or NXP makes for them and begin to incorporate that into their own silicon manufacturing? No. Hard to tell what is going in there because of the Apple curtain, but overall, I think that would be a better fit than NVIDIA. The other rumor mill out was TSMC at least investing in Arm. And that makes sense to me as well because TSMC has an IP network. And one of the reasons they're so successful as a foundry is they have this IP partnership throughout the industry. Is probably the most cohesive from a foundry perspective. As a result, it makes sense for them to have a very high level of interest in what's going on with Arm, who's going to buy Arm, and how you keep Arm neutral, so to speak, the overall semiconductor space. However, if Apple or TSMC buy Arm, what does Samsung do? Because
Yeah.
Samsung's a competing foundry uh,
MediaTek.
in that space. Yeah, MediaTek, all the different foundries that are out there. What do they say in there? But there is a lot of IP that TSMC has developed that is, I wouldn't say readily available to other foundries, but is there. So that might work better in a model especially better than Nvidia.
I'll have to take the opposite side of the argument with you on Apple. I just don't think that's something they're going to be as interested in. It's almost as uninteresting for them as getting into the actual TV set business that everyone thought they were going to get into, or even the Apple car. It's just not their bag, if I were to quote Austin Powers. It isn't. And so I think it's one of those defunct hypotheses that just at the end of the day, there's going to be too many conflicts. I mean, think about it. If Apple owns Arm, what's Samsung going to think? How are they going to react? Will they even be able to pass the regulatory hurdles that and gates that they need in order to get approval in China? But Samsung, South Korean government, is going to be kind of tough, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. There'd be issues there.
Yeah, but then I think there's just going to be issues, period. I think from a regulatory standpoint, if you think about the integration and what would need to happen as part of the regulatory approvals globally for this deal to happen, most definitely China is going to be in the way. They'll stymie the transaction in a similar fashion as they stymied the NXP deal with Qualcomm, right?
Yeah, I think if any U.S. company goes after Nvidia, you might see China really drag their feet based upon what's occurring in the trade wars right now.
Right, and another thing that might really make sense is that there's some sort of investor consortia that gets together in the UK to try to buy it back and bring it to their home shores, right? Rather than having, they could use it.
No, I think
right? Post Brexit, they could use it.
I think that is whether Softbank spins it out, creates an IPO to then put money back into Softbank, which the Sun needs desperately right now, or yes, to see if you can find a group of investors that are, I would say, either British or European based and put together a deal. There's certain areas that Arm would fit with. They could fit with an EDA company such as Synopsys or Cadence or Mentor. They could, if it was Mentor, you could roll that up. Siemens could purchase them. They've got the purchasing power to do that. You do have a little bit of an issue there because Siemens does have a device-making arm, but it's mostly, I will also call it power devices,
industrial,
and industrial type items. But that's a huge market as we consider the industrial IoT. But it would favor Siemens from getting those IoT devices moving forward. And it may also be I'll call it kick in the pants that the industrial IoT industry needs to really start embracing the IoT and start to create some really killer IoT solutions for the industrial markets that I think are still missing out there.
One of the things I'm really curious about is whether or not Nvidia is seeing limitations in their GPU-centered narrative. I mean, going back to the first bullet item, which is why would Nvidia buy Arm? You mentioned Siemens with a lot of the industrial applications. It's a lot of IoT stuff going on there. But if you think about it, a lot of the GPU stuff is not really edge endpoint. I mean, if it's edge, it's going to be more heavy-duty workloads and processing that you're going to be doing with the GPUs at the edge. Whether it's for telco applications or industrial analytics that you're doing closer to the factory or what have you. It is curious because the company has made such an effort to make the GPU sort of the hammer for every nail. Are they trying to figure out, well, now how do we broaden our portfolio so that we can start to go into embedded, right? And sort of dictate that how that segment of the market evolves, right? Because they don't really have a embedded device or IoT play other than the analytics part, right?
If they bought Arm, that would be a grow your own. Okay,
Yeah.
that would be, have to figure out how to build a device, figure out how to embed it with my CUDA GPU, and then move forward. They have one or two CUDA offerings that look like it's trying to be embedded, but to be fully embedded, you've got to add that CPU component in there, which then they have to go purchase from someone else to make it work. That line of thinking is potentially there, but why not go buy a company that specializes in embedded?
Yeah.
And get going there.
Maybe avoid the conflicts of interest or sticky situations. One of the things that we're going to be talking about with one of our friends, former Gartner analyst Jim Walker, is about heterogeneous compute, and that's a big thing. I would say kind of instrumental or core to Arm's strategy. When you think about it, Nvidia is really a participant in the heterogeneous narrative. I think I'm using narrative too much. Anyways, for the sake of getting to the end of this podcast quicker, we'll just use narrative. They're kind of a participant. They're not they don't own the framework. They don't own the broader solution architecture or the device architecture. And so that might be a motivation that is driving their interest. But going back to some of the challenges they're going to have with integration, the competitive landscape, and the sort of impact that they'll have there, which may cause some angst. It's going to be a very challenging acquisition.
I would agree. When you buy a company, you look for synergy, or you look for how is this going to help me grow and develop business that maybe I'm not in right now. The growing and developing new business part is there, but that's where it stops. There's no real connection between what Nvidia does and what Arm is doing. And the cultures are extremely different from what you see in corporate presentations and financial analyst talks. So I'm struggling with it. And I think if Nvidia does purchase Arm, I think it's going to be one of those things that they end up overpaying and then spinning it out in several years when they find out the experiment doesn't work.
Yeah, but Dean, it's all about the shoes.
All about the shoes?
Jensen has like the coolest shoes. Have you ever seen him on stage?
A few times, yeah.
Half of the time I don't even pay attention to him, like staring at his shoes.
You're staring at the shoes. Well, then, spending time in Oxford in England would be important, but I think there's less expensive ways to do that.
So maybe, who knows, with all this money that they have, this available capital they have to trade, maybe they'll buy Nike, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? I was thinking maybe, if they're hot-looking shoes, they've got to be Italian, Leonard.
So last impressions, let's talk about the last bullet point, and we'll make it short. The industry implications. What's your gut feel?
Neutrality. I'll make it one word.
Oh, wow.
One word. Neutrality for Arm.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to go with a sentence, and I think it's just maybe I'll go with a word as well. Weird. And then maybe I'll explain in one sentence why I use that word. I think it's just going to be contentious and unsettling to the industry. I think that's what we need to consider. Now, that doesn't mean that there are other obvious options. I think this whole question of where is Arm going to land is going to be a very challenging question to answer and resolve going forward. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this ends up, and who knows, maybe everybody will go the way of RISC-V and land in Switzerland, and then you're going to get your neutrality there, Dean.
Neutrality, and maybe I can travel there and hop over the border to Italy and get some killer shoes.
Yeah, there you go. And RISC-V, speaking of RISC-V, that's a topic for another day, right?
Oh, yep.
So, Dean, I think we're going to call it a wrap. And I just want to thank you once again for joining. It's always great chatting with you. Looking forward to our next topic, which is, I believe, going to be heterogeneous compute. So for all of our viewers and listeners, make sure you catch that one. It's going to be really cool. Very, very important topic, I think. Wouldn't you say, Dean?
Extremely important topic as the industry moves forward, and our guest speaker is going to be very enlightening, I think.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Guaranteed. And so to our listeners and viewers, thank you for joining us. And please subscribe to our YouTube and Apple podcast channels. And visit us at www.next-curve.com. And until next time, be safe, keep healthy. And Dean, it's time for you to get your drink.
And killer shoes.
Okay, take care, Dean.
You too, Leonard. Bye.
Visit us at www.next-curve.com.